the most dangerous man in New York City, was about to do the most terrifying thing he had ever done in his 40 years of living: fall in love honestly. The night Alessandro Conti decided to stop being Alessandro Conti, it was raining. Not the gentle, romantic kind of rain that poets write about. No, this was a violent, angry New York downpour, the kind that flooded gutters, overturned umbrellas, and sent civilians scrambling into doorways like frightened mice. Thunder cracked across the Manhattan skyline like a gunshot, and lightning split the sky in two clean halves, illuminating the silhouette of a man standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of a penthouse so high above the city that the people below looked like scattered ants drowning in rivers of their own making. Alessandro Conti didn't flinch at the thunder. Men like him didn't flinch. They had long ago made peace with loud, sudden noises, because men like him were usually the ones causing them. He stood with one hand in the pocket of his tailored black trousers, the other wrapped loosely around a glass of aged Barolo that cost more per bottle than most people's monthly rent. His jaw was sharp enough to cut glass. His dark eyes, the color of deep mahogany, with flecks of something colder underneath, were fixed on the storm outside with the detached, almost philosophical expression of a man watching something he understood instinctively. Chaos, destruction. Power with no particular loyalty to anyone. Yes, he understood storms very well. Behind him, the penthouse breathed in quiet luxury. 14 rooms, Italian marble floors imported from Carrara, original Caravaggio paintings secured behind climate-controlled glass, a kitchen that had hosted 3 Michelin-starred chefs. A master bedroom whose bed linen was changed daily by a housekeeper who had been with the Conti family for 31 years and who knew, with absolute certainty, that the man standing at that window was the loneliest human being she had ever encountered in her long and eventful life. Giulia knew everything about Alessandro Conti. She knew he hadn't slept more than 4 consecutive hours in over 2 years. She knew he ate his meals alone at a dining table built for 20, and that he never sat at the head, always 2 seats down, as though he was still saving that chair for his father. She knew he kept a single photograph in the drawer of his bedside table, not of a woman, not of a conquest, but of himself at age 7, sitting on his father's shoulders at Coney Island, laughing so openly and so freely that it looked like a picture of a completely different person. A person who had not yet learned what the Conti name truly cost. She also knew, because she had been quietly listening from the hallway for the past 20 minutes, that tonight was different. Tonight, something had broken open inside Alessandro Conti. She could feel it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm, a tightening in the air, a heaviness, a sense that something was about to give way. She was right. Alessandro turned from the window, set his wine glass down on the marble console with a soft, deliberate click, and spoke to the empty room. "I'm done," he said quietly. The words were barely above a whisper, but in the silence of that vast, magnificent, deeply lonely penthouse, they landed like a verdict. Luca Conti appeared from the shadow of the hallway, because Luca was always somewhere nearby, always watching, always ready. He was 34 to Alessandro's 40, lighter in build, quicker to smile, but just as dangerous when the situation demanded it. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed and one eyebrow raised, because Luca had learned long ago that the best response to his brother's dramatic pronouncements was patience. "Done with what exactly?" Luca asked carefully. "The Marcello situation, the Rotterdam shipment, the—" "Done with women who want Alessandro Conti," Alessandro said. He picked up his wine glass again, turned it slowly in his fingers. "Done with every woman who walks into a room and sees the penthouse before she sees my face. Done with being chosen for what I have instead of who I am." He paused. "If I am, in fact, anything at all anymore." Luca was quiet for a moment. Then, because he loved his brother and because he was also privately worried about him, he said very gently, "Alessandro, you are the most powerful man in the northeastern United States. You control 4 ports, 2 senators, and a significant portion of the city's restaurant industry as a very convincing front business. Women are going to notice that." "Exactly." Alessandro turned to face him then, and his expression was not the face he wore in boardrooms or at the head of a long table when he was deciding someone's fate. It was something rawer than that, something almost painfully human. "Exactly, Luca. Every single woman I have been with in the past decade, every single one knew who I was before she knew anything else. They came to me preloaded with an agenda. They wanted the penthouse, the protection." The credit cards with no limits, the social elevation of being Alessandro Conti's woman. His voice dropped. Not one of them ever asked me what I was afraid of. Not one of them ever sat with me in silence and chose to stay in it. Not one of them. He stopped himself, set the glass down again, pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. Not one of them, he finished quietly, ever loved me. The rain hammered the windows, thunder rolled across the sky. Luca uncrossed his arms. He walked slowly across the marble floor and stood beside his brother, looking out at the storm-battered city beneath them. He was quiet for a long time, because Luca Conti, for all his sharpness, understood the weight of what his brother had just admitted, and he respected it enough not to rush past it. Finally he said, "So what are you going to do?" Alessandro's jaw tightened, and then, slowly, dangerously, like the first edge of a plan crystallizing out of pure will, he almost smiled. "I'm going to disappear," he said. The plan, when Alessandro laid it out 3 days later in the private study of the penthouse, with Luca seated across from him, Victor Nazarov standing by the door like a large, unimpressed wall, and Giulia pointedly pretending to dust a bookshelf in the corner so she could listen, was simultaneously the most brilliant and the most insane thing any of them had ever heard. Alessandro Conti would, for all practical purposes, cease to exist. Not permanently, not in the way his enemies sometimes cease to exist, which was a different matter entirely, but Alessandro Conti, the name, the reputation, the weight of it, would be carefully folded away like an expensive suit placed in storage. In its place would emerge a new man, a simple man. A man with a modest apartment in Brooklyn, a beat-up second-hand car, a fabricated backstory as a freelance graphic designer scraping together a living, and a name that contained not a single syllable of danger. Alex Conte, Alessandro said, writing it on a notepad and sliding it across the desk. Luca stared at it. "That's barely a disguise, you just removed 3 letters. It's not about the name, it's about everything else." Alessandro leaned back in his chair. "New wardrobe, old clothes, nothing tailored. I'll take the apartment on Fulton Street, the one we use for operations. Clean it out, make it look lived in. I'll drive the 9 Honda Civic that Marco left in the garage." He paused. "And I will go to places where women who don't know my name go. Ordinary places, coffee shops, parks, community events." He said the words community events with the careful pronunciation of a man reading from a foreign language phrasebook. "And I will talk to women, as Alex Conte, freelance graphic designer, Brooklyn, nothing." Victor spoke for the first time in his flat, gravelled Russian accent. "And what exactly are you testing for?" Alessandro's dark eyes moved to him. "I want to know," he said slowly, "which woman will choose a broke, ordinary man and mean it, which woman will sit across from a man with nothing impressive to offer and still lean in, still ask questions, still come back." He paused. "That woman, whoever she is the only woman in the world I can trust." The room was silent. Then Giulia, from her corner by the bookshelf, said quietly and without looking up from her dusting, "Don Enzo would have called that wisdom." Alessandro looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face, quick, unguarded, gone before anyone could name it. "Go ahead then," he said. Brooklyn, as it turned out, was louder than Alessandro had anticipated. He had grown up in New York, yes, but his New York was a city of marble lobbies and soundproofed cars and restaurants where the staff recognized him before he reached the door. Brooklyn was a different animal entirely. It was a city of noise and color, and people who bumped into you on the sidewalk without apologizing, of corner bodegas with cats sleeping on the counter, of children racing down the street on bicycles at 7 in the morning because no one had told them the world was supposed to be quiet. He hated it immediately. And then after about 48 hours, he found it oddly, unsettlingly alive. He drove the Honda Civic. It made a sound like a chronic cough every time he started the engine, and the driver's side window had to be coaxed open with a specific 2-handed technique that Luca had demonstrated and Alessandro had practiced 3 times in the parking garage with the focused intensity of a man preparing for a military operation. He wore jeans, actual denim jeans, purchased from a mid-range department store by a junior associate following very specific instructions, and plain shirts in navy and grey. He got a haircut from a barber shop on Atlantic Avenue, where the barber talked without pause for 45 minutes about the Knicks, and didn't once look at Alessandro with any expression other than professional indifference. It was, Alessandro thought, the best haircut he'd ever had. He set up a profile on a dating app because Luca had insisted, because apparently this was how ordinary people met each other in the current century, a fact that Alessandro received with the grim acceptance of a man being told the rules had changed while he wasn't looking. The profile was careful, a slightly blurry photo taken candidly that showed him well enough without showing him too precisely. Alex Conte, 38, Brooklyn, graphic designer. I make better coffee than I make conversation, but I'm working on both. Luca had written the bio. Alessandro had read it 3 times, decided it was embarrassingly casual and posted it anyway. Within 6 hours, he had 47 matches. He scrolled through them with the detached attention of a man reading quarterly reports, because the faces blurred together quickly, beautiful women, carefully posed, filters and angles and captions that told him everything about what they wanted to project and nothing about who they actually were. He matched. He sent messages. He received messages. He had conversations that felt like auditions. Because they were auditions, he understood that now every one of them, the whole performance of early courtship, the careful presentation of a curated self. He met a woman named Isabel who was a fashion consultant, extraordinarily beautiful, who on their first coffee date spent 40 minutes telling him about her apartment renovation and then asked him, with a sudden, calculated look, whether he had any investor contacts in the real estate space. He didn't call her again. He met a woman named Priya who was a corporate lawyer, brilliant and sharp and funny in a brittle way, who on their second date confessed, almost off-handedly, as though testing the water, that she had Googled him and couldn't find much, and wasn't that a little strange for someone in the creative industry? He smiled and said his digital footprint was minimal by choice. She looked at him for a long moment, weighing something, and he watched the interest dim slightly in her eyes when the calculation didn't add up in her favor. He didn't call her again either. He was beginning to wonder whether the experiment was flawed, whether what he was looking for simply didn't exist, or whether it existed but not on a dating app, not in coffee shops on the Upper West Side, not in the carefully constructed arena of modern dating, where everyone was simultaneously performing and auditioning and measuring. He was, on a grey Thursday morning in his 4th week as Alex Conte, sitting in a coffee shop on Court Street with a lukewarm Americano, and the particular expression of a man reconsidering his entire worldview, when the door opened, and a woman walked in from the rain, shaking water from her umbrella with the unself-conscious vigor of someone who had entirely stopped caring whether she looked graceful, and promptly collided with a display stand of travel mugs, sending 4 of them rolling across the floor in 4 different directions. "Oh, for the love of," she said, loudly and with feeling, and then immediately dropped to her knees on the coffee shop floor to gather the mugs, entirely unbothered by the fact that people were looking, entirely unbothered by anything except the practical problem of 4 rolling mugs that needed catching. Alessandro watched her. She was a full-figured woman, round and soft and unapologetically present in her body, in a way that struck him as almost radical in a city where women seemed to be perpetually apologizing for taking up space. She was wearing a yellow raincoat that was aggressively bright against the grey morning, and her dark hair was half escaped from a bun that had clearly started the day with ambitions it hadn't been able to sustain. She had a canvas tote bag on one shoulder that was so stuffed with books and folders that it had the silhouette of a small, overpacked suitcase. She collected all 4 mugs, stood up, placed them back on the stand with the careful deliberateness of someone returning something borrowed, and then looked directly at the barista behind the counter and said, "I am so sorry. I've broken nothing, I've checked. Can I please have a large oat milk latte, and whatever you have that involves chocolate because I have had a morning?" The barista laughed, actually laughed, the easy, unguarded laugh of someone who has just encountered a person they find genuinely delightful. Alessandro, who had not felt genuinely delighted by anything in a very long time, set down his lukewarm coffee. She found a table 2 away from his, dropped her enormous tote onto the seat across from her with a thud that rattled the table slightly, and pulled out a thick folder which she opened, and immediately began annotating with a pen she'd retrieved from somewhere inside the architectural chaos of her bag. She had reading glasses that she put on with the automatic efficiency of someone who has long since stopped thinking about how she looks in them. Small, round, tortoiseshell frames that made her look, Alessandro thought, like a very focused academic who had accidentally wandered into the wrong decade. She was objectively not the kind of woman who appeared in his life. She wasn't polished. She wasn't performing. She was sitting 2 tables away from him in a coffee shop on a rainy Thursday, annotating a folder and eating a chocolate croissant with complete dedication, and she hadn't looked at him once. That, Alessandro Conti realized with a slow, stunned recognition, was the most interesting thing that had happened to him in months. He did something he hadn't done since he was approximately 19 years old. He tried to think of something genuine to say to a stranger. Her name, as he would discover, in the slightly chaotic conversation that followed when he leaned over and asked, with somewhat less smoothness than he was used to projecting, whether the folder she was annotating was as serious as it looked, was Clara Pemberton. She was 36 years old. She was an editor at a mid-sized independent publishing house in Manhattan, which explained the folder, a manuscript she was working on, and the tote bag full of books and occupational inevitability, she explained, with the tone of someone who had made peace with a chronic condition. She had grown up in a small town in Connecticut, moved to New York at 22 with exactly 1 suitcase and an enormous amount of confidence that she now described, with cheerful retrospect, as completely unjustified but extremely useful. She told him this in approximately the first 10 minutes of conversation, not because she was oversharing, but because she spoke the way some people move with a natural, forward momentum, without second-guessing each step. She asked him questions and actually listened to the answers, which was something Alessandro had begun to believe was a lost art. She had a laugh that arrived without warning and left quickly, like a small bright explosion. She disagreed with something he said about a film they'd both apparently seen. She'd read the book first and found the adaptation patronizing, and she disagreed with him directly, without softening it or checking his face first to see if disagreement was permitted. Alessandro, who spent most of his professional life surrounded by people who agreed with him as a matter of survival, found this almost physically startling. By the time her oat milk latte was finished, she had to leave a meeting, she said, already standing and reorganizing the geological strata of her tote bag. But she paused, halfway through putting on her aggressively yellow raincoat, and looked at him with a directness that had no coyness in it whatsoever. "This was a good conversation," she said. "As a simple statement of fact, I don't have many of those accidentally. You should keep your phone somewhere accessible." And then she handed him her card, a small, simple white card with just her name and number, and walked out into the rain, her umbrella immediately turning inside out in the wind, which she addressed by simply holding it at a different angle and continuing to walk as though the weather was an inconvenience she had long ago negotiated a ceasefire with. Alessandro sat at the table for a full 3 minutes after she left. Then he picked up his phone and called Luca. "I found her," he said. On the other end of the line, a pause. Then Luca said very carefully, "Found who exactly?" Alessandro looked at the small white card in his hand. Clara Pemberton, nothing else on it except a number. No title, no company, no social media handle, just a name and a way to reach her. "The one," he said. And Alessandro Conti, who had not been certain of anything personal in 15 years, said it with the absolute iron-boned certainty of a man who has just recognized something he didn't know he'd been looking for. She wasn't waiting to be chosen. She had already chosen herself, and that was exactly what terrified him. Alessandro Conti had negotiated with some of the most dangerous men in the world. He had sat across tables from Sicilian crime lords who hadn't smiled in decades, from Russian oligarchs whose eyes carried the flat, affectless calm of men who had ordered terrible things over breakfast, and then eaten well. He had walked into rooms where the temperature dropped when he entered, where men twice his age shifted in their seats and found reasons to look at the floor. He had, on 3 separate occasions that he did not think about in the daylight, talked his way out of situations that should have ended with him in the ground. He was not, by any reasonable measure, a man who got nervous. And yet on the Wednesday evening 6 days after the coffee shop, 6 days during which he had looked at Clara Pemberton's card approximately 40 times, and picked up his phone to call her approximately 39 times before setting it back down, he was sitting in the Honda Civic outside a Thai restaurant on Smith Street in Brooklyn, engine idling with its characteristic tubercular cough, and he was nervous. Genuinely, physically, embarrassingly nervous. His hands were steady, they were always steady, that was a discipline he'd built into his bones long ago, But there was something happening in his chest that he could only describe as a kind of structural uncertainty, like a building that was sound but had just noticed, for the first time, that it was built on a fault line. He had called her on the fourth day. She had answered on the second ring, sounding unsurprised, as though she'd been expecting the call but hadn't been waiting for it. A distinction, Alessandro was already learning, that was very Clara. They had talked for 50 minutes, which he only knew because he checked his phone when they hung up and felt a minor shock at the number. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been on the phone with anyone for 50 minutes. His calls were typically 60 seconds or less. Decisions, information, acknowledgement, done. With Clara, 50 minutes had felt like 12. She had suggested the Thai restaurant herself, named it with the familiarity of a regular, told him they had a green curry that would rearrange his understanding of what food could be. She said this with total seriousness, and told him 7:30 on Wednesday. Not asked, told. He had said yes with a promptness that would have deeply unsettled anyone who knew him. He got out of the car. She was already inside when he arrived, sitting at a corner table with her reading glasses pushed up on her head, holding her hair back like a headband, which was almost certainly not their intended function, and she was reading the menu with the focused attention she apparently applied to everything, as though the choice between the green curry and the massaman was a decision that deserved her full intellectual engagement. She looked up when he approached, and her face did something uncomplicated and immediate. It opened. A real smile, unperformed, the kind that starts in the eyes and travels downward and doesn't stop to check itself in a mirror along the way. "You found it," she said. "I found it," he said, sitting down across from her. "Good, GPS is a moral failing, and I respect that you navigated." He hadn't navigated, he'd used GPS, but something made him not say that. What Alessandro had not anticipated, what no amount of strategic preparation could have prepared him for, was how fundamentally different it felt to be with a woman who had no idea who he was. Every interaction he'd had with a woman in the past decade had been conducted under the weight of his name. Women came to him already performing, already in the role, already shaped by the idea of Alessandro Conti before they'd spent 10 minutes in a room with the actual person. They gave him what they'd calculated he wanted. They were careful, and the carefulness was always visible if you knew how to look. A slight over-management of expression, a laughter that arrived a fraction of a second too late, questions that were really statements dressed up in question marks. Clara Pemberton was not performing. She argued with him over whether literary fiction had become too self-referential. She thought yes, aggressively so, and she said so with the confidence of someone who had spent 15 years editing manuscripts and had earned the right to an opinion. She told him, midway through her green curry, which was in fact extraordinary, about the worst manuscript she'd ever had to edit. A deeply confused thriller in which the author had clearly never spoken to a woman, ridden a horse, or visited the country where the story was set, and had seemingly done all research via a single Wikipedia article and a lot of imagination. She described it with such precise, affectionate exasperation that he laughed, a real laugh, not the controlled, social sound he usually produced in public, but something that came from further down, something that surprised him on its way out. She noticed, her eyes caught the laugh and held it for just a moment, curious and pleased. "You don't do that much," she said. He looked at her. "Do what?" "Laugh like you mean it." He had no prepared response for that. He was not used to being observed. He was used to observing. It was a disorienting reversal, and he sat with it for a moment, genuinely uncertain what to do with the sensation of being accurately seen by someone he had known for less than 2 hours. "I'm out of practice," he said finally. It was the most honest thing he'd said to anyone in years. She nodded, not pushing it, not pulling at the thread to see where it led. She just accepted it and moved on, which was, he was discovering, very much how Clara operated. She didn't excavate. She just paid attention, steadily and without agenda, and allowed things to surface at their own pace. They stayed at the table for 3 hours. The restaurant filled and began to empty and filled again. Their dishes were cleared and replaced with tea, and then with the specific comfortable disorder of a table at the end of a long, good dinner, water glasses, a shared dessert that had been Clara's idea, a conversation that had moved through books and cities and childhood memories, and the specific loneliness of living in New York, which Clara described as being surrounded by 8 million people and occasionally feeling like the last person on Earth. but in a way that you eventually stop fighting and start finding oddly peaceful. Alessandro looked at her across the table and thought, she is describing my life exactly, and she doesn't know it. He drove her home afterward, an offer she accepted practically, without the performance of reluctance some women staged. She lived in a third-floor walk-up in Park Slope. A real apartment, lived in and warm, books visible through the window from the street, a small collection of plants on the sill that she described from the passenger seat as a rotating cast of succulents, most of whom I have killed through excessive optimism and insufficient sunlight. At the door of her building she turned to him, and there was a moment, the kind of moment that has its own specific gravity, that bends slightly towards something, and she looked at him with that same direct, unguarded quality that had struck him in the coffee shop, like someone who had simply decided that honesty was more efficient than coyness. I had a genuinely good time, she said. No qualifier, just good. So did I, he said. Good, she tilted her head slightly. You're a bit of a mystery, Alex Conte. I can't quite figure out what's underneath the surface. His heart, which was a disciplined organ accustomed to maintaining rhythm under pressure, did something irregular. Maybe that takes time, he said. I have time, she said simply, and went inside. He called Luca on the drive back to the penthouse, switched from Alex Conte back to Alessandro Conti the moment he crossed the bridge, the way an actor drops a character at the edge of a stage, except that tonight he noticed, the dropping felt slightly less clean than usual. Something of Alex Conte was staying with him across the bridge, something loosened. How was it? Luca asked. Alessandro was quiet for a moment, watching the Manhattan skyline arrange itself outside the windshield, all glass and light and vertical ambition. She told me I was a mystery, he said. Luca made a sound that was dangerously close to a laugh. You, a mystery, she has no idea. No, Alessandro said. She doesn't, he paused. And Luca, it is the first time in 15 years that I have wished, genuinely wished, that there was nothing to know. Luca went quiet at that. Because Luca understood what that meant. He understood the weight of the Conti name and what it did to everything it touched. He understood that Alessandro had spent 40 years being Alessandro Conti, and that there was a version of his brother, 7 years old, on his father's shoulders at Coney Island, laughing without calculation, who had been slowly buried under the architecture of that name, layer by careful layer. Be careful, Luca said, not a threat, a love. I know, Alessandro said. She'll find out eventually. I know. And when she does. I know, Luca, his voice was quiet and final, I know. They saw each other 6 more times over the following 3 weeks. Alessandro kept notes, not on paper, never on paper, but in the precise and disciplined archive of his memory, which had been trained since boyhood to retain everything relevant. He collected Clara Pemberton the way he had once, as a young man first learning the business, collected intelligence on adversaries, with total attention, with no detail too small, with the understanding that knowledge was the only true currency. Except this was nothing like collecting intelligence. This was something else entirely. This was the particular, bewildering experience of finding someone genuinely interesting and being unable to stop. He learned that she took her coffee with oat milk and 1 sugar, but only in the morning. In the afternoon she switched to tea, specifically a loose-leaf Earl Grey that she kept in a small tin in her desk drawer, and about which she had strong, specific opinions. He learned that she walked everywhere when she could, not for exercise but because she thought better in motion, and that she had a habit of narrating her surroundings very quietly, when she was deep in thought, half-sentence observations about what she was seeing, as though she was continuously editing the world into prose. He learned that she was funny, not the performed, carefully calibrated funny of someone working for a reaction, but the organic funny of a person who found the world genuinely absurd and couldn't always resist saying so. She could make a dry, 2-word observation that arrived so quietly and so precisely that its impact was delayed by 3 full seconds, and then it detonated and left him unable to recover his composure for an embarrassing length of time. He learned that she was, beneath the warmth and the humor, quietly fierce. She had strong convictions about fairness that were not negotiable. She had a keen, almost surgical eye for dishonesty. He noticed it most when they talked about other people, how she would listen to a story and then say, gently but without equivocation, that person wasn't being straight with you, or there's something she wasn't saying. She was not cynical, but she was clear. That clarity made him uncomfortable in ways he was learning to sit with. Because there was, sitting between them at every table, in every coffee shop and restaurant and park bench they occupied together, a thing he wasn't saying. A vast, heavily furnished thing. A thing with 4 ports and 2 senators, and a Caravaggio painting in a climate-controlled case, and a history that would rewrite every single conversation they'd ever had if she knew it existed. He told himself it was too soon. He told himself the test wasn't complete yet. He told himself he needed more time to be certain of her, certain of himself, certain that what he was feeling was real and not the projection of a profoundly lonely man onto the first person who'd looked at him without wanting something. He was, in short, telling himself a great many things. And then Sophia Mancini walked back into his life, and everything became significantly more complicated. Sophia Mancini was, by any objective measure, spectacular. She was 32, Italian-American, with the kind of face that photographers described as structural. All clean planes and perfect geometry, the sort of beauty that didn't rely on lighting or angle but simply existed, bluntly and without apology, as a fact of the physical world. She had been briefly, incandescently part of Alessandro's life 18 months ago, a 3-month chapter that ended when he understood, clearly and without drama, that Sophia's interest in him was a calculation she'd been running from the moment they met. She was not cruel. She was simply strategic, in the way of someone who had understood very early that beauty was a resource with a limited window, and had decided to invest it wisely. She reappeared on a Tuesday, in the lobby of the building where the Conti Group's legitimate offices occupied 4 floors, Alessandro in his Alessandro persona, suit restored, name restored, the whole weight of who he was settled back on his shoulders as it was every morning when he crossed the bridge from Brooklyn. She was in the lobby because she had arranged to be there, which Alessandro understood immediately, because Sophia did nothing accidentally. "Alessandro," she said, with the specific smile of a woman restarting a negotiation, "you look well." He looked at her. She was, as always, stunning. She was also, as always, performing. Every angle of her posture was considered. Every element of her appearance was deployed. She looked at him with her head tilted at the angle she'd discovered made her eyes look larger, and she touched her own wrist in the way she did when she wanted to draw attention to the delicacy of her hands, and the whole thing was so precisely engineered that it would have been impressive if it hadn't been exhausting. 6 weeks ago he thought he might not have noticed how much work it was, or he might have noticed and not cared. He was used to this. It was the language of his world. But he had spent 3 weeks sitting across from Clara Pemberton, who communicated in an entirely different language, direct, unornamented, sometimes awkward in its honesty. And now, standing in his own lobby watching Sophia deploy her entire arsenal at close range, he felt something he hadn't expected. He felt tired. "Sophia," he said, "this isn't a good time." Her smile adjusted barely imperceptibly, but he caught it. "I was hoping we could have dinner, catch up." "We don't have anything to catch up on." She looked at him for a moment. The calculation was visible now, running just beneath the surface. "I heard you've been spending time in Brooklyn," she said lightly, conversationally, as though she was making small talk. "Something about a new interest." Alessandro went still. It was the stillness that his enemies had learned to be afraid of, not the loud stillness of suppressed anger, but the deeper, quieter stillness of absolute attention being brought to bear on a single point. "Where did you hear that?" he asked. His voice was very calm. Sophia touched her wrist again. "New York is a small city when you know the right people." He looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "Stay away from Brooklyn, Sophia. Stay away from anything in Brooklyn." His voice had dropped half a register, and the affable looseness of Alex Conte was entirely absent from it. This was Alessandro Conti, all of him, unfiltered, and Sophia, who had pushed a great many people's limits in her life, recognized the edge she'd just reached and took a small, involuntary step back. "Of course," she said, lighter now, almost conciliatory. "Good," he turned toward the elevator, then without looking back, "Don't come to this building again without an appointment." He rode the elevator up in silence, watching the lobby shrink below him through the glass. Someone had been talking. Someone in his circle knew about Brooklyn, knew about the apartment on Fulton Street, knew enough to have fed it to Sophia, whether out of carelessness or calculation he didn't yet know. He would find out. He always found out. But beneath the cold, efficient machinery of that concern, Something else was running, a different kind of alarm, quieter and more personal. If Sophia knew he'd been in Brooklyn, other people knew. And if other people knew, it was only a matter of time before someone decided that the most effective way to get to Alessandro Conti was through the woman in the yellow raincoat with the inside-out umbrella and the tote bag full of books. Clara. He thought her name and felt the fault line shift. That evening, as Alex Conte, he met her at a bookshop on Atlantic Avenue that she'd been wanting to show him, an independent place, narrow and overstuffed, with a cat named Douglas who lived near the biography section and regarded customers with magnificent indifference. Clara moved through it the way she moved through everything, with a proprietary delight, pulling books from shelves and pressing them into his hands with the urgency of someone making introductions at a party. "This one," she said, handing him a worn paperback. "This will break something in you and then fix it back better, I promise." He took the book and looked at her, at the genuine enthusiasm on her face, unguarded and warm and entirely herself, and he made a decision that was either very brave or very reckless and was possibly both. He was going to tell her the truth. Not tonight, not yet. He needed to be sure. He needed to know with the certainty that the rest of this required, that what Clara Pemberton felt for Alex Conte was real enough to survive the weight of what came with Alessandro. But soon, before someone else told her first, before the fault line gave way beneath them both. He bought the book. He read it that night, alone in the penthouse in the chair by the window where he usually stood and looked at the city without seeing it. He read it in one sitting, the way she'd said he would, and when he finished it at 2 a.m, he sat for a long time looking at the last page. She was right, it broke something, and then fixed it back. He was, Alessandro Conti realized, in a great deal of trouble. Not the kind he was equipped for. The most devastating lies are not the ones we tell other people. They are the ones we tell ourselves, that we have more time, that the truth can wait, that love is patient enough to survive a secret the size of a life. It was Jenny Walsh who first said it out loud. Jenny Walsh had been Clara Pemberton's best friend since the second week of their freshman year at NYU, when they had been assigned to the same introduction to literature seminar and had independently, simultaneously written the same margin note on the same passage of the same novel. This man has never spoken to a woman and looked up from their respective copies to find each other already laughing. That was 20 years ago. In those 20 years, Jenny had watched Clara navigate a landscape of men with the calm, unsentimental pragmatism of someone who had decided very early that she would rather be alone and comfortable than coupled and performing. She had watched Clara end a 4-year relationship with a perfectly decent architect because she described the relationship as nutritious but not interesting, like a multivitamin. She had watched Clara decline a marriage proposal from a man who was, by every external measure, a catch, because she said, with characteristic directness, "I don't feel like myself when I'm with him, and I refuse to spend the rest of my life being a lesser version of myself for someone else's comfort." Jenny loved Clara enormously and had, over 2 decades, developed a finely calibrated radar for every variation of Clara's emotional weather. She could read a Clara text message at 3 a.m. and know, from syntax alone, whether it was good insomnia or bad insomnia. She could hear Clara say, "I'm fine," in 14 different ways and decode exactly how fine she was not. So when Clara called her on a Saturday morning, 3.5 weeks into whatever was happening with Alex Conte, and said with a specific careful lightness that Jenny recognized immediately as the tone Clara used when she was trying to underreport something significant, "I think I might actually like this one." Jenny put down her coffee cup, sat up straight and said, "Tell me everything. From the beginning, leave nothing out." Clara told her, the coffee shop collision, the card, the Thai restaurant, the bookshop, the 6 weeks of seeing each other 2, sometimes 3 times a week in that easy, unforced rhythm that Clara described as not trying to be anything, just being it. Jenny listened to all of it without interrupting, which was remarkable for Jenny, who interrupted professionally and without remorse in all other contexts. When Clara finished, Jenny was quiet for precisely 4 seconds. Then she said, "Clara, this man, what does he do again?" "Freelance graphic design. And he lives in Brooklyn. Fulton Street. And you've been to his apartment." A pause. "We've mostly met at places." Jenny's radar, which had been quietly humming for the past 10 minutes, now produced a clear, sharp tone. "You haven't been to his apartment." We've been busy, we've been doing things, going places. Clara Elizabeth Pemberton, 6 weeks, you have not been to this man's apartment. It doesn't necessarily mean. What does he look like? Jenny said. Describe him to me, physically. Clara described him. Jenny, who had lived in New York for 20 years and had developed, through sheer accumulated experience, a reasonably precise mental taxonomy of the city's male population, listened to the description and felt something tighten at the back of her mind. Tall, dark, that particular quality of stillness. The way a room apparently reoriented itself slightly when he walked in, not because he did anything dramatic, but because he had a specific kind of gravity. The hands, Jenny said. He has the hands of someone who has, I don't know how to explain it, someone who has made decisions with them, real decisions. Jenny was quiet again. What? Clara said. Nothing, Jenny said. I just think you should go to his apartment. Clara thought about this for 3 days. She thought about it with the particular, focused unease of someone who has been happily not thinking about something and has now been made to think about it. She hadn't pushed about the apartment. She hadn't pushed about a great many things, the occasional pause before he answered questions about his work, the way his phone sometimes seemed to be somewhere unreachable, the single occasion when they'd been walking down a street in Brooklyn and a man passing in the opposite direction had looked at Alex with an expression that Clara had catalogued and then deliberately filed away because it didn't fit. The expression wasn't recognition exactly. It was closer to deference. The involuntary, muscle memory deference of someone in the presence of authority. She had filed it away because she liked him and because she wasn't a person who manufactured problems, but Jenny's voice was now sitting in the middle of the filing cabinet, refusing to be quiet. On the 3rd day she texted him, I want to cook dinner for you this week. At yours, I'll bring everything, you just have to let me in and try not to critique my pasta. His response took 11 minutes, which was longer than usual. Thursday, I'll send you the address. She noticed the 11 minutes. She also noticed that he hadn't had the address immediately available, or at least hadn't offered it immediately, which to a person of Clara's attention was not quite the same thing as the same thing. She noted it. She filed it under things to understand, not things to fear. And then she bought the ingredients for carbonara, because if something was going to be clarified, it might as well be clarified over good food. The apartment on Fulton Street was, Alessandro had to admit, convincing. Giulia had overseen the staging of it, he'd asked her, trusting no one else's eye for the texture of a genuinely lived life, and she had done it with the quiet precision of an artist. Books on the shelves, not arranged decoratively but stacked with the organic disorder of actual reading, some horizontal, some vertical, some with torn paper bookmarks. A small kitchen that showed evidence of use. A desk with a computer and a scattered collection of reference materials that supported the graphic design fiction. Prints on the wall, interesting but not expensive. A coffee maker that was slightly too good for the rest of the apartment, which was, Giulia had said wisely, exactly the kind of inconsistency that made a space feel real. Alessandro had spent 3 evenings there before Thursday, not just inspecting but inhabiting, sitting in the rooms, understanding their dimensions, learning the view from the window. Cooking a meal in the kitchen alone, so that the space had his presence in it and not just his props. He understood with a cold clarity that he couldn't quite shake, method acting his own life. Clara arrived at 7 with a bag of groceries, and the specific energy of someone who had decided that a thing needed doing and was doing it. She looked at the apartment with the open, curious attention she brought to everything, moving through the living room, knotting the books, touching the spine of one or two, looking at the prints on the wall with the appraising eye of a person who trusted objects to tell her things. It's nice, she said, and then turning to look at him, it's you. He felt something tighten in his chest at that. She cooked in his kitchen with the comfortable authority of someone who cooked well and knew it. She talked while she cooked, about a manuscript she was editing, about a conversation she'd had that week with a debut novelist who was, she said, brilliant and terrified in equal measure, and trying to let the terror win. She asked Alessandro questions about a design project he'd invented and had, over the past weeks, developed with enough internal consistency that answering questions about it felt almost honest. Almost. She plated the carbonara. They sat at the small kitchen table. She poured the wine, a bottle she'd brought, a good one, Italian, and he'd watched her select it with the quiet attention of someone who knew wine and had chosen this one with specific intent. She wasn't performing generosity. She was just generous. "Can I ask you something?" she said halfway through the meal. "Yes," he said. The word arrived before caution could stop it. She looked at him steadily. "Who are you really?" The question landed in the middle of the table between them, and neither of them looked away from it. "What do you mean?" he said. His voice was level. It was always level. He had trained it to be level through situations that would have shattered most voices entirely. "I mean," she said carefully, not with accusation, but with the particular patience of someone who has decided to say the true thing and is going to say it all the way to the end, "that there are moments with you where I feel like I'm talking to two different people. Most of the time I feel like I know you, genuinely know you, better than I know people I've been with for years. And then occasionally there's this," she searched for the word, "door, that's closed, that I don't think I'm imagining." He was quiet. "I'm not trying to crowbar it open," she said. "I'm not a crowbar person, but I want you to know that I see it, because I think you're used to people not seeing it, and I think that sometimes makes it worse." Alessandro Conti, who had sat in rooms with men who would kill him without hesitation, who had maintained absolute composure under pressures that would have collapsed most human beings like paper structures in rain, felt, sitting at a small kitchen table in a staged Brooklyn apartment, the specific, destabilizing sensation of being completely and accurately seen by another person. He opened his mouth, and his phone rang. He would spend a long time afterward being unable to decide whether that phone call was the worst possible timing or the only thing that had saved him from doing something irreversible before he was ready. The number on the screen was Victor's, which meant only one category of thing, and that category did not wait. "I have to take this," he said. He heard the shift in his own voice and watched it register on Clara's face, not fear, not suspicion, just that steady, accurate attention. "I'm sorry, 1 minute." He stepped out of the kitchen. Victor's message was brief and efficient, as Victor's messages always were. A problem, specific and urgent, connected to the Rotterdam shipment that had been causing complications for 3 weeks. A problem that required Alessandro, not Alex, immediately. He came back into the kitchen. Clara was clearing the plates, not with impatience, but with the practical grace of someone who keeps moving while she thinks. "I have to go," he said. "I'm so sorry, it's a work thing, an emergency." She turned and looked at him, at 8:30 on a Thursday night. "I know, I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment, 3-4 seconds of the clear, measuring gaze that he was learning meant she was deciding something. Then she handed him the leftover carbonara in the container she'd apparently located and prepared while he was on the phone, because Clara Pemberton was a practical woman, even when the situation was not entirely comfortable. "Take this," she said, "eat something later." He took it, something about the gesture, so quietly, stubbornly caring, so devoid of drama or punishment, made the tightness in his chest so acute it was almost physical. "Clara," he started. "Go," she said, not coldly, but firmly. "Handle your thing, but Alex," she paused and her eyes were very direct, "we're going to finish that conversation." It was not a threat, it was a promise, and the difference he was learning was everything with Clara. He handled his thing. He handled it with the cold, complete efficiency that had made the Conti name what it was. 2 hours in a private room in a building that didn't appear on any public record, with Victor and Luca and 3 other men, resolving a situation that needed resolving in the manner that such situations were resolved. He was Alessandro Conti throughout all of it, fully and without remainder, the entire gravity of who he was deployed in service of an outcome he needed. And when it was done and he was in the car, he sat for a long moment before starting the engine. He had the container of carbonara on the passenger seat. He looked at it. He thought about Clara standing in his staged kitchen, cooking real food from real ingredients she'd carried in on the subway, asking him who he really was with the gentleness of someone who already suspected the answer was complicated and had decided to ask anyway, not because she wanted ammunition, but because she thought he deserved to be asked, because she thought truth, however difficult, was better than the comfortable management of its absence. He thought about the door she described, closed. He was the one who had closed it. And he had closed it, he understood now, not to protect her, though he had told himself that repeatedly, with the self-serving precision of a man constructing a justification, but to protect himself, to keep the possibility of this of her alive a little longer without the risk of it ending the moment she knew what she was actually looking at. He was a coward. He, Alessandro Conti, who had never in his adult life used that word in connection with himself, was being a coward about a woman who cooked him carbonara and told him the truth across a kitchen table. He picked up the phone, he called Luca. "I need to tell her," he said. Luca, who had been expecting this call for approximately 2 weeks, said, "I know. I need to do it before someone else does. I know that too. If she," he started again, "if she decides she wants nothing to do with me when she knows." "Then that is her choice," Luca said, "and it is her right and you will respect it." A pause, but Alessandro. "What? I've heard you talk about a lot of women. I've never heard you talk about one the way you talk about this one." Alessandro looked at the Manhattan skyline through the windshield, all that vertical, ambitious, brilliant, brutal light. "No," he said quietly, "neither have I." He had decided, Saturday, he would tell her Saturday. He would take her somewhere quiet and he would tell her everything, the name, the life, the reality of what Alessandro Conti was and did and had and cost, and he would let her do whatever she needed to do with that information. He owed her that. He owed her honesty and he was going to deliver it, and whatever came after was what came after. He was resolved. He was ready. And then on Friday morning, Sofia Mancini uploaded a photograph to her social media. It was a photograph taken at a charity event 6 weeks ago before Brooklyn, before Alex Conte, before the coffee shop on Court Street. Alessandro was in it in his suit at the edge of the frame, unmistakably himself. Sofia was beside him, smiling. The caption was brief and precisely engineered, old friends and familiar faces. Some things don't change, tagged naturally with his full name, Alessandro Conti. The photograph on its own meant nothing. It was the sort of thing that circulated in certain New York social circles without consequence. Alessandro's face was not globally famous. He was not a celebrity. He was known in specific rooms to specific people. But Clara Pemberton, it turned out, knew one of those people. Her colleague at the publishing house, a woman named Andrea, who moved in Upper East Side circles and read the social pages with religious devotion, saw the photograph on Friday afternoon and saw the name, and spent approximately 45 seconds connecting it to what Clara had told her about the man she was seeing, and then walked directly to Clara's office and said, with the breathless urgency of someone delivering breaking news, "Clara, I need to show you something." Clara sat at her desk for a long time after Andrea left. She looked at the photograph on her screen. She looked at the name, Alessandro Conti. She typed it into a search engine with the calm, methodical efficiency of someone conducting research, because that was, in the end, what she was, an editor, a person trained to find the true shape of a thing beneath its presented surface. What came back was insignificant, not explicit, not criminal, not in any documented public sense, but the shape of it was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The business interests, too numerous and too diverse to have been built by ordinary industry. The connections, too specific and too powerful to have been earned by ordinary means. The careful absence of detail in certain areas that in a legitimate businessman would have been straightforward public record. She read for an hour, and then she sat very still for a very long time. She was not a naive woman. She was 36 years old and she had lived in New York, and she understood that the world had layers, and that some of those layers were dark, and that people in those dark layers were still people, still human, still capable of warmth and humor, and buying the right book in a second-hand bookshop, and laughing in a way that felt like the first honest sound in a very quiet room. But she was also a woman who had built her entire life on the premise that honesty mattered, that the shape of a thing mattered, that you could not build anything real on a foundation that was actually a performance. And Alex Conte, her Alex, with his coughing Honda and his bare apartment and his out-of-practice laugh, was a performance. She closed her laptop. She picked up her phone, she looked at his name in her contacts, Alex Conte. 2 letters different from the truth. She put the phone face down on her desk. And Jenny Walsh, who was apparently psychic or possibly just sufficiently attentive, texted at that exact moment, "You okay?" Clara looked at the text for a long time. Then she wrote back, "I will be." And she meant it. She always meant what she said. That was the difference between her and the man who had been lying to her, not because she was better, not because she was without complexity or contradiction, but because she had decided a long time ago that she would rather be fully, uncomplicatedly herself, and accept whatever that cost, than be anything less for anyone else's benefit. She meant it. She would be okay. But first, she was going to be furious. There is a particular kind of fury that belongs only to a woman who has been underestimated by someone she was beginning to love. It is not loud. It is not violent. It is cold and clear and absolute, and it is the most frightening thing in the world. She didn't call him. This was the first thing Alessandro noticed when he woke up on Saturday morning, that Clara hadn't called. He had sent her a message Friday evening, his usual easy, unforced Alex Conte message, suggesting they meet at the farmer's market on Saturday morning, the one in Grand Army Plaza that she'd mentioned twice with the specific enthusiasm she reserved for things she genuinely loved. He had planned it carefully. The farmer's market, then a walk, then somewhere quiet, and then the truth. The whole truth, laid out without defense or justification, just the full, unvarnished reality of what he was, offered to her hands to do with as she chose. She hadn't responded. By Friday night he had told himself she was busy or asleep, or had left her phone somewhere in the geological chaos of her tote bag. By Saturday morning he had stopped telling himself things and started paying attention to the silence, which had a specific quality to it, not empty but full of something deliberate. He called her at 9. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voicemail greeting was characteristically direct. "This is Clara. Leave a message if it's important. If you're not sure whether it's important, it probably isn't." He had smiled the first time he heard it 3 weeks ago. He did not smile now. He left a message. His voice was steady. It was always steady, but there was something underneath it that even his own disciplined ear could detect, something that might in a less controlled man have been called worry. He called Luca instead. "Has anything," he started. "Yes," Luca said, and the single syllable carried enough weight that Alessandro's hand tightened on the phone. "Sophia posted a photograph last night. You're in it, tagged." The silence that followed was very brief and very complete. "Who's seen it?" Alessandro said. It was not a question. The photograph itself limited, but Andrea Marsh works at Clara's publishing house. She runs in the right circles. She saw it Friday afternoon. Alessandro closed his eyes, just for a moment, just long enough to feel the full, precise dimension of what had happened and what it meant. "How long ago?" he said. "Yesterday, around 3 o'clock. He had sent Clara a message at 7 Friday evening. After Andrea Marsh had walked into her office, after Clara had already seen the photograph, after she had already sat with the information for 4 hours and decided, deliberately, consciously, with the full force of her considerable intelligence, not to respond. She wasn't ignoring him. She was thinking. And Clara Pemberton thinking was, Alessandro understood with a cold, sinking certainty, a great deal more consequential than most people acting. She texted him at 11:15. Not a call, a text, which was itself a message, because Clara was someone who called when she wanted a conversation and texted when she wanted control of the terms. The text said, "Come to the bookshop on Atlantic, 2 o'clock, come as whoever you actually are." He read it 3 times. "Come as whoever you actually are." 7 words that were simultaneously an invitation and a verdict and a challenge, and a door held open at an angle that could either be welcoming or about to close. And he couldn't tell which from this distance, and he understood that he wasn't supposed to be able to tell, that the not knowing was intentional, that she was giving him nothing to prepare against, because she had decided that the only thing she was willing to receive from him was something that couldn't be prepared. He put the phone down. He looked around the penthouse, the marble, the Caravaggio, the dining table with its permanently empty head chair, the whole enormous, magnificent, deeply impersonal architecture of Alessandro Conti's life. He got dressed in the clothes from the closet in the Fulton Street apartment, which Giulia had quietly laundered and returned, the jeans, the plain navy shirt, the jacket that had no lining because it hadn't needed one, the clothes of Alex Conte, the man who didn't exist. He looked at himself in the mirror of the penthouse bathroom, which was the size of most studio apartments, and reflected him in triplicate from 3 angles simultaneously. He looked like Alessandro wearing Alex's clothes, The posture was wrong for Alex. The stillness was wrong for Alex. The eyes had never been Alex's at all. He drove the Honda Civic. He owed her that much consistency, at least. The bookshop on Atlantic Avenue was called Papered, and it was the kind of place that existed in defiant opposition to the idea that physical books were a dying proposition, narrow and warm and overflowing, with handwritten staff recommendation cards tucked into shelves, and a cat named Douglas who occupied the biography section with the territorial confidence of a landlord. Clara had brought him here on their 4th week together, moving through it with the proprietary delight of someone returning to a place they love, pressing books into his hands, talking about them with the infectious specificity of a person who had spent her entire professional life in love with the written word. He had loved it immediately, which was not something he would have predicted about himself. He arrived at 1:58 and found her in the back of the shop, in a small reading nook between the literary fiction section and a shelf dedicated entirely to translated works. She was sitting in one of the 2 mismatched armchairs that occupied the nook, her legs crossed, a book open in her lap that he was almost certain she was not reading. She was wearing a dark green sweater and her hair was down. He had only seen it fully down twice before, and both times it had struck him as something she did when she wasn't managing her presentation, when she had simply let herself be exactly as she was without revision. Douglas the cat was on the arm of her chair, regarding everything with supreme indifference. She looked up when he appeared at the entrance of the nook. Her expression was composed, not cold, not warm, composed in the way of someone who has done the interior work of the past 24 hours and has arrived at a place of clarity that they intend to maintain. He sat in the chair across from her without speaking, waiting, because he understood with the full and chastened understanding of a man who has miscalculated badly in a domain that matters, that this was not his moment to speak first. She looked at him for a long time. "Alessandro Conti," she said finally, not with drama, not with anger, just with the precision of someone placing a correct name on a thing that has been mislabeled. "Yes," he said. "Not Alex. No. Not a freelance graphic designer. No." She nodded slowly, as though confirming something she'd already fully accepted. "I read about you," she said. "Quite a lot, actually. I'm a thorough person." "I know." "You know," a pause. "What do you know about me, Alessandro? What did you actually learn while you were running your test, or whatever this was? What did you learn about me that you feel you actually know?" The question was not rhetorical. She was asking it as a real question with a real expectation of an answer. That was Clara, even furious, even hurt, she was precise. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely clasped between them, the posture of a man who has set down his defenses, all of them, deliberately. "I know that you take your coffee with oat milk and 1 sugar in the morning and Earl Grey in the afternoon," he said. "I know you walk everywhere because you think better in motion. I know you narrate your surroundings quietly when you're deep in thought, half sentences, like you're editing the world as you move through it. I know your laugh arrives without warning and you don't manage it. You just let it happen, and that it's the most unconstructed thing I've ever heard from an adult human being in New York City." He paused. "I know you ended a relationship with an architect because it was nutritious but not interesting. I know you read the last page of a book first sometimes, not because you can't tolerate suspense, but because you want to know whether the destination is worth the journey. I know you disagreed with me about that film adaptation in our first real conversation, without once checking my face to see if disagreement was permitted. I know that when I had to leave abruptly on Thursday you handed me leftover carbonara for later, because even when something is uncomfortable you don't stop being kind. I know," he stopped, steadied himself. "I know that you told me I was a mystery and that you had time. I know that you meant both of those things. I know that you are the most fully, uncomplicatedly yourself person I have met in 20 years of adulthood. And I know that I have lied to you since the moment we met, and that there is no version of that fact that is acceptable." The bookshop was quiet around them. Somewhere near the front a customer was asking about a title. Douglas shifted on the arm of Clara's chair. Clara was very still. "Why," she said, 1 word, but the density of it was enormous. It contained the whole question, every dimension of it, the why of the test and the why of the deception and the why of her, specifically, why he had kept coming back, why he was sitting here now in Alex Conte's clothes with Alessandro Conti's eyes, offering her the truth at the precise moment it had become unavoidable. He told her about the 15 years of women who had wanted Alessandro Conti before they'd met him. He told her about the calculation he'd seen behind too many pairs of eyes for too many years. He told her about his father, Don Enzo, who had loved his mother with a completeness that Alessandro had witnessed as a child, and had spent his entire adult life unable to replicate. Not because he was incapable of love, he understood that now, but because he had never been in a room with someone who wanted him rather than what he represented. He told her about the night of the storm, the decision at the window, the terrifying simplicity of wanting to be chosen for who he was rather than what he had. He told her about the test. He was honest about it, he didn't soften it, didn't reframe it, didn't make it sound more dignified than it was. It was a test. He had devised it deliberately. He had deployed it on multiple women, and all of them had failed it, and then she had walked into a coffee shop on Court Street and knocked over a display of travel mugs, and talked to him for an hour without once looking at him like he was a resource to be managed, and he had called his brother and said, "I found her," with the certainty of a man who recognized something essential. He told her all of it. When he finished, the silence was very long. Clara looked at the book in her lap. She turned it over once in her hands, then she looked up. "I'm going to say several things," she said, with the measured cadence of someone who has organized their thoughts very carefully, "and I need you to let me say all of them before you respond." "Yes," he said. First, she held up one finger. "I am angry. I want to be clear about that. Not performing anger, not strategic anger, not anger as a negotiating position. I am genuinely, substantively angry because you sat across from me for 6 weeks and watched me be honest with you, completely, unreservedly honest, in the way I am with everyone because I don't know how to be otherwise, while you were operating from behind a fiction. That is a real harm. You took my honesty and gave me a character in return. That is not fair, and it is not small, and I am not going to minimize it." "You're right," he said, "it isn't small." Second, a second finger. "I understand intellectually, I understand why you did it. I am not without empathy. I can see the logic of a person who has spent years surrounded by people who want the idea of them rather than the reality. I can see how that would corrode something, how it would make a person desperate for something real. I understand the impulse." She paused. "Understanding it does not excuse it. I want to separate those two things clearly." "Understood." Third, she looked at him directly now with the full, undeflected gaze that he had come to think of as her most characteristic expression, the look that meant she was going to say the true thing. "In 6 weeks of knowing Alex Conte, who was a fiction, I saw you, the real you. Whatever you were trying to perform, whatever character you thought you were playing, you weren't playing it very well. Because what I actually saw was a man who laughs with his whole body when something genuinely surprises him, who listens the way people used to listen before phones, who gets quietly, visibly moved by things he doesn't want to admit move him, who has been so lonely for so long that honesty, simple, ordinary human honesty, lands on him like," she stopped, "like something he's been starving for." Alessandro said nothing. There was genuinely nothing to say. "So here is what I need to know," Clara said. She set the book down. She sat forward slightly, mirroring his posture, elbows on knees, direct and undefended. "Not what you feel, not what you want. What I need to know is this: if I walk away from this chair right now and never speak to you again, can you respect that? Without consequence, without the weight of what you are being brought to bear on my life in any form whatsoever." The question cut to the very center of everything, because she was asking, in the most precise possible terms, whether Alessandro Conti, who controlled ports and politicians, who resolved problems in private rooms, who had the power to make things happen and things disappear, could accept the agency of one woman who might choose to say no to him. Whether his love, if that was what this was large enough to contain her freedom within it, or whether it was just another form of possession wearing a more sympathetic mask. Alessandro looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "completely and without condition. If you leave this chair and decide you want nothing to do with me, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have reason to be afraid of that decision." He held her gaze. "That is the only promise I can make you right now that I am absolutely certain I will keep. Whatever else I have lied about, I have never once lied about who you are to me. I have sat across from you and felt something I had genuinely stopped believing was possible for a man like me. And if you choose to walk away from that, I will grieve it for a very long time, but I will respect it, because you are not a thing to be managed. You are a person, and you deserve to choose." Douglas the cat stood up, stretched with magnificent indifference, and relocated himself from Clara's armchair to a nearby shelf, as though he had decided the conversation was now at a point where his supervision was no longer required. Clara watched the cat relocate. She was quiet for what felt to Alessandro like a geologically significant period of time. Then she said, "I'm not leaving the chair." He was very still. "I'm not leaving the chair," she said again, "because I think and I reserve the right to be furious about this for a specific period of time that I will determine unilaterally. I think that what we actually have, underneath the fiction and the test and the absolutely unacceptable deception, is real. And I am not someone who walks away from real things because they are complicated." She looked at him steadily. "But I need truth from this point forward, non-negotiable. The full truth on your terms at whatever pace makes sense, but no more closed doors that I'm not allowed to acknowledge." "Yes," he said, the word was immediate and unequivocal. "And I need to meet your brother. Anyone who has watched this entire situation unfold needs to be evaluated by me in person." Despite everything, despite the gravity and the reckoning, and the full emotional weight of the past hour, Alessandro almost smiled. "Luca will find that terrifying," he said. "Good," said Clara, "he should." She did not take his hand when they left the bookshop, but she walked beside him on the sidewalk, close, in the easy, unself-conscious way of someone who has chosen proximity as a deliberate act, and when a gust of November wind came down Atlantic Avenue with enough force to stagger her slightly sideways, he put a hand at her back without thinking, and she didn't move away from it. That hand, that staying. It was not a resolution. It was not forgiveness, complete and uncomplicated. It was something smaller and realer than that, a decision to continue, provisional and honest, one step at a time on a street in Brooklyn on a grey November afternoon. Alessandro Conti, who was used to certainty, found that he could live with that. More than live with it. He could build something on it. If she'd let him. And across the city, in a building that didn't appear on any public record, Victor Nazarov received a message from Luca Conti that said simply, "Stand down." She stayed. Victor, who was not a sentimental man, read it twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket and did something that the people who worked with him would not have recognized. He smiled. Love does not ask you to be less than you are, but it will, without fail, ask you to be more honest than you have ever been willing to be. And the men who answer that question truthfully, those are the ones worth keeping. 3 months. That was how long it took for the world of Alessandro Conti and the world of Clara Pemberton to begin, carefully and without rushing, to occupy the same space. It did not happen all at once. Nothing real ever does. There was no single dramatic moment of merger, no grand declaration in a penthouse, no cinematic reveal where Clara stood in the marble foyer of Alessandro's life and gasped at the chandeliers. It happened the way genuine things happen between two people who have both been hurt by speed and have decided, independently and then together, that slow was not a weakness but a form of respect, a form of care. A form of saying, "This matters enough to do carefully." The first week after the bookshop, Alessandro told her more. Not everything was a long country, and you did not cross it in a week, but more. He told her the shape of his life with the careful, methodical honesty of a man who had spent decades being economical with truth, and was now, deliberately and with effort, learning a different habit. He told her about the business, the legitimate operations, extensive and genuinely successful on their own terms, and the other operations, older and darker, and rooted in a history that began long before he was old enough to choose. He told her about his father, Don Enzo Conti, who had built an empire with his hands and a particular vision of loyalty, and who had loved his family with a ferocity that was the only model Alessandro had ever had for what love looked like at full strength. He told her these things at the small kitchen table in the Fulton Street apartment because he had decided, without discussing it with Luca or Victor or anyone, that the apartment was where this conversation belonged, not the penthouse. The penthouse was Alessandro Conti's. This apartment, staged and fictional as it had begun, had become something else in the 6 weeks of dinners and conversations and a carbonara that he still thought about. It had become the place where he had been most honestly himself, accidentally, while trying to be someone else entirely. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting, which was not her natural mode and therefore cost her something, which he understood and was grateful for. She asked questions afterward, good questions, the questions of someone who was trying to understand rather than judge, who was building a picture rather than constructing a verdict. She did not pretend it was simple. She did not offer him absolution he hadn't asked for. But she stayed at the table, and she refilled his wine glass when it was empty, and when he finished speaking she was quiet for a long moment and then said, "I'm not going to tell you that I'm completely comfortable with all of it." "I know," he said. "I'm going to tell you that I'm choosing to be here anyway, with my eyes open, because closed eyes are not something I do." "I know that too." "And Alessandro," she said his name, his real name, with the ease of someone who had been practicing it privately and was now ready to use it in full, "if there is ever a moment where being here puts me in a position I cannot stand in with integrity, I will tell you, directly, and we will deal with it directly." He looked at her across the table, the woman who had walked into a coffee shop in a yellow raincoat and knocked over 4 travel mugs and handed a stranger her card with nothing on it but a name and a number. The woman who had sat in a bookshop armchair and told him she was angry, and then told him she was staying and meant both things with the same absolute completeness. "I would expect nothing less," he said. And Clara Pemberton, for the first time since the bookshop on Atlantic Avenue, smiled at him the way she used to smile, open, unguarded, arriving without management and leaving without apology. She met Luca on a Tuesday evening at a restaurant in the West Village that Alessandro had chosen for its privacy and its excellent wine list. Luca arrived first, because Luca was always early, positioning was instinct, and was sitting at the table when they arrived, and he stood when they approached with a courtesy that was entirely genuine and also, Clara observed with the sharp peripheral attention she brought to everything, faintly nervous. Luca Conti was nervous. She found this enormously reassuring. She shook his hand, sat down, accepted the menu and said without preamble or social padding, "You wrote his dating profile." Luca blinked. "He told you that?" "He did. I make better coffee than I make conversation. That's not him. The rhythm is wrong. He's more," she tilted her head, considering, declarative, less self-deprecating. Luca looked at his brother. Alessandro's expression was the specific expression of a man who is both impressed and slightly concerned by what he has gotten himself into. "The coffee line was mine," Luca confirmed. "He wanted to write 'I value efficiency and direct communication,' and I told him that would generate 0 matches." "He was right," Clara said. "That would have generated 0 matches." She looked at Luca steadily. "You love your brother." It wasn't a question. Luca held her gaze. "More than anything," he said. "Good," said Clara. "Then we want the same thing." She picked up her menu. "Now, what's good here? I've heard the branzino, but I'm skeptical of any restaurant that puts branzino on the menu as though it's still 2019. Luca, who had been prepared for confrontation, and received instead something far more disorienting, a person who was simply, directly, unfashionably real, laughed. The easy, unguarded laugh of someone genuinely surprised into it. Alessandro watched them from across the table and felt something settle in his chest, something that had been displaced for a very long time, sliding quietly back into its correct position. She saw the penthouse for the first time on a Saturday in December, when the city had put on its winter costume, and the streets of Manhattan were bright with cold light, and the particular festive energy of a place that decorates itself extravagantly and means it. She stood in the foyer and looked at it, really looked at it, the way Clara looked at everything, with the full attention of someone taking an accurate inventory, and was silent for a long moment. "It's extraordinary," she said finally. "It's lonely," he said. He said it simply without performance. She turned to look at him. "Yes," she said, "I can see that." She looked at the dining table, the long, magnificent table with its permanently empty head chair. "Why do you never sit at the head?" He looked at the table. It was a question no one had ever asked him. Giulia knew the answer, he was certain, but Giulia did not ask. Luca knew better than to ask. Victor would not have understood the question. "My father sat there," he said. "I keep thinking," he stopped. "I keep thinking I'm not ready to be the person who sits there." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she walked to the table, pulled out the chair 2 positions from the head, the chair he always used, and sat in it. She looked at the empty chair at the head. "I think," she said carefully, "that the person who sits at the head of a table is not necessarily the person who has finished becoming who they are. Sometimes it's the person who is willing to keep becoming. in front of other people, without the pretense of being finished. Alessandro looked at her sitting at his table in his space in the life he had built and lived inside of without ever quite inhabiting, and something that had been locked for a very long time opened. Quietly, without drama, the way real things open, not with a crash but with the small definitive sound of a mechanism finally finding its correct alignment. He walked to the table, he sat at the head. Giulia appeared from the kitchen doorway, not because she had been summoned, but because Giulia always knew, in the way of someone who had spent 31 years paying attention to the emotional weather of a family, when a moment was happening. She stood in the doorway and looked at Alessandro sitting at the head of the table for the first time in 15 years, and at the woman sitting 2 seats down watching him with clear, warm, uncomplicated eyes. Giulia had promised herself, when Alessandro had first told her about the plan, the fake apartment, the false name, the test, that she would not interfere and would not comment and would simply observe, because she was a woman of discretion and had earned her silence through decades of service. She had maintained this promise admirably, but now she looked at the two of them at that table and she said, to no one in particular and entirely to herself in Italian, very quietly. Finally, Sofia Mancini, it turned out, had not acted alone. The photograph, the one that had appeared on her social media with Alessandro's name tagged, and with the timing that could not have been accidental, had been a coordinated move. A man named Caruso, a mid-level associate with ambitions that exceeded his judgment, had fed information about Brooklyn to Sofia, had arranged the photograph's posting, and had calculated, incorrectly, as it turned out, that destabilizing Alessandro's private life would create an opening in the Conti organization's power structure that he could exploit. Alessandro handled it with the cold, complete efficiency that characterized his handling of all such miscalculations. Caruso was removed from the organization in a manner that was permanent and non-negotiable. Sofia received a conversation, brief, direct, and delivered by Alessandro personally, that made the parameters of her future behavior entirely clear. She left New York 3 weeks later. No one mourned her departure. Victor, who had overseen the investigation with his customary emotionless precision, presented the findings to Alessandro in the usual private room in the usual building. Alessandro listened, made the necessary decisions, signed what needed to be signed, gave the necessary instructions. And then he did something that surprised Victor. He said, "Is there anything else that could reach her? Any exposure, any angle, any vulnerability in the Brooklyn connection that we haven't already closed?" Victor understood immediately what he was asking, not about the business, not about the organization, but about Clara. Whether Clara was safe. Whether the specific, unrepeatable person who had walked into Alessandro's staged life and chosen to stay in his real one was protected. Victor went through it methodically, because Victor was nothing if not methodical. Every connection closed. Every trace of Alex Conte that could be followed backward to Clara Pemberton had been carefully, thoroughly severed. She was not exposed. She was not reachable through the organization's complications. Alessandro had quietly, systematically, over the course of 3 months, constructed around her the most comprehensive protection his considerable resources could provide. Not because she had asked for it, not because she knew about it, but because it was the one thing he could do that was both true to who he was and uncomplicated in its motivation. He loved her. He had not said it yet, not aloud, not in the direct, declarative way that the feeling deserved. He was working up to it with the specific, uncharacteristic patience of a man who understands that some things, once said, change the entire landscape irrevocably, and who wants to be very sure the landscape is ready. Victor looked at him across the table. "She is completely protected," he said, "on all fronts." Alessandro nodded. Victor paused, which was unusual for Victor, who did not pause, who moved from point to point with the efficiency of a machine designed for exactly that purpose. He paused, and he looked at his employer for a long moment, and then he said in his flat, unornamented Russian accent, something that Alessandro would remember for the rest of his life. "My wife, when I met her, she also didn't know who I was." A pause. "I told her in the 2nd month she was angry, angrier than I thought she could be." Another pause. "We have been married for 19 years. Last week she made me borscht because I had a cold." He picked up the folder from the table, straightened it. "Tell the woman the real things, all of them at the pace that is honest. Don't make her wait for the person you actually are." He stood. "That is my only advice." He left. Alessandro sat alone in the room for a while. Then he took out his phone and sent Clara a message. Saturday, I want to take you somewhere I've never taken anyone. Bring the yellow raincoat, it'll be cold. Her response came in 4 minutes. The yellow raincoat goes everywhere with me, that's not a special requirement. Where are we going? Coney Island, he wrote. A pause, then in December. Alessandro, it'll be freezing. I know, he wrote, I want to show you something. Coney Island in December was a different creature, entirely from its summer self. The boardwalk was almost empty, scoured clean by an Atlantic wind that arrived without apology and left nothing unconsidered. The amusement rides were shuttered and still, their geometry abstract against the white winter sky. The ocean was grey and enormous and completely unbothered by the season or the absence of an audience. There was a particular beauty to it, the beauty of a place that exists for itself when no one is performing for it. They walked the boardwalk with their hands in their pockets and their shoulders slightly hunched against the wind, and Clara's yellow raincoat was, Alessandro noted, doing exactly what he'd expected, making her visible against the grey landscape like a single bright word in a long, quiet sentence. He told her about the photographs, the one from his bedside drawer, himself at 7 on his father's shoulders, laughing at something now lost to time. He described it because he hadn't brought it, but he described it with the precision of someone who has looked at it so many times it exists on the inside of the eyelids. He told her it was taken here, on this boardwalk. On a September afternoon, when Don Enzo had taken his sons out of the city for a day and been, for those hours, simply a father. Not a Don, not an authority, not a name that rearranged rooms, just a man with his boys on the boardwalk, laughing at something. Clara listened. She didn't try to fix it or frame it or resolve it into something tidier than it was. She just received it, the way she received everything, with the full and patient attention of someone who understands that being heard is often more important than being answered. When he finished, they were standing at the railing looking at the ocean. He sounds like someone worth missing, she said. He was, Alessandro said. He was also complicated. The things he built, the way he built them, I have never been able to fully separate the man from the structure he made. He paused. I'm not sure I ever will. You don't have to, Clara said. People are allowed to be complicated and loved at the same time. That's not a contradiction, that's just people. He turned to look at her. The wind was making her eyes water, which she was addressing by blinking with tremendous dignity, refusing to acknowledge it as anything other than meteorological inconvenience. I love you, he said. He said it the way Clara said things, directly, without construction, without softening or gilding or delivering it inside a performance. Just the true thing, placed in the cold December air between them, offered without decoration. Clara stopped blinking against the wind. She looked at him, the full, direct, open gaze, the one that had no coyness in it, no angle, no management. The look that had first made him understand, in a coffee shop on Court Street, that she was something genuinely different. I know, she said, I've known for a while. Of course you have, he said, and despite everything, the cold, the wind, the weight of everything that had led them here, he smiled. The real one, the one that came from further down. I love you too, she said. I want to be clear that I'm not saying that because you said it. I'm saying it because it's true and I believe in stating true things directly. I know, he said. Good, she turned back to the ocean for a moment. Also, I cannot feel my face. I want that on the record. Noted. I'm going to need coffee. Immediately, hot coffee. This was a romantic location and I appreciate the sentiment, but Alessandro, it is December, it is Coney Island, it is approximately 4 degrees. He was laughing before she finished the sentence. The laugh that came from further down, the one without calculation or management or caution, the one that belonged to a 7-year-old on his father's shoulders on this same boardwalk on a September afternoon, free and unguarded and entirely, simply alive. Clara heard it. She turned and looked at him laughing on the empty December boardwalk, the city distant behind them and the ocean enormous in front, and the wind making a sound in the railings like something singing to itself. She smiled, the open, arriving, unmanaged smile. There he is, she said softly, not to him exactly, to something, to the version of him she'd seen underneath the performance and the fiction and the magnificent armor of Alessandro Conti, the person who had been there all along, waiting, with the patience of someone who had almost stopped believing anyone was coming. She took his hand. They stayed at the railing for a while longer, looking at the ocean, and Alessandro Conti, who had once stood at a floor-to-ceiling window high above a storm-battered city, telling an empty room he was done, stood on a winter boardwalk, holding the hand of a woman who had chosen him, completely and with full information, and felt something he had not felt in so long that he had no ready name for it. He felt at 40 years old, on an empty boardwalk in December, with his face going numb and the Atlantic being enormous and indifferent in front of him, and a woman in a yellow raincoat, beside him who loved him on purpose and with open eyes. He felt at home. Alessandro Conti had power most men only dream about. But power never once kept him warm at night. He ran his test. He watched women choose the penthouse over the person, the name over the man, the empire over everything underneath it. And then Clara walked in. No agenda, no performance, no interest in what he had. Just honest, completely inconveniently, beautifully honest. She didn't pass the test because she was perfect. She passed it because she never once stopped being herself, not for comfort, not for convenience, not even when the truth was complicated enough to walk away from. And that is the rarest thing in this world. Not beauty, not ambition, not strategy. Somebody who chooses you with their eyes wide open. Most people never find that. Some spend a lifetime building everything around them and die having never known it. Alessandro almost did. The question I'll leave you with is this. Are you showing the world who you actually are, or are you still waiting until it feels safe? Because if Clara had made herself smaller, quieter, more palatable, he would have passed her by and never known what he missed. Think about that. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and let me know in the comments what was the moment that got you. I'll be reading Black Heart